Nice to meet you. The woman who entered the room suddenly greeted me. If I were to marry her, the debt my father left behind would be written off. However, there was a scar on her face. What's most concerning above all else is the presence of my father. Are you sure this is okay? When I asked her, she felt silent for a while. My name is Robert, and I'm 45 years old. My father, who ran a small town factory, and my mother raised me, and I'm their only child. My father had a strong desire for independence from a young age and started a metal processing factory in his mid-20s. However, the business performance was not good, and he used to argue with my mother every night. When I entered junior high school, I learned that our family business was really on the verge of collapse. I knew there were things that I should give up on, no matter how much I thought about it, but still, my father never gave up hope and always smiled in front of me. Even though I knew that our poor living conditions were solely due to my father's actions, when I saw him working hard, I couldn't truly resent him. Then, I also started helping out at the factory and realized that I like precision work like machining and that was something that runs in the family. If possible, I would like to pursue the same profession as my father. However, I didn't know how long this factory would last. With such a conflict in mind, I studied at an industrial high school, and when I went home, I helped my father at his factory. I spent my days doing things unrelated to school club activities and a love life. In my last year in high school, most of the students had started looking for a job, but I was going to take over my father's factory. However, my father was vehemently opposed to it and said, "It's not such an easy world. Get some experience at other companies at least." That's what he said. If we were in the same industry, it would be the same working here or there. I thought. I tried to persuade him many times, but he didn't let me. At the time, I thought that it was because of my own lack of ability. But looking back now, maybe he didn't want me to go through the things he went through. After that, I left home as if we'd had a fight. I got a job at a steel mill in a neighboring city and worked very hard. I remember being scolded by my seniors often, as my father's idiosyncratic way of doing things had become ingrained in me since childhood. As for my father, he was still running his business on the edge. He was a kind-hearted manager who clung to the outdated notion of quality over quantity and did not prioritize profits. He was being recognized for his technical skills, and he was even offered a merger, but he stubbornly refused due to concerns about a potential decline in quality. He was extremely stubborn, and I couldn't say anything because it was too frustrating. I didn't have the luxury of worrying about my parents. I was so occupied with my daily work that love and marriage were never on my mind in my 20s and 30s. Before I knew it, I had hit my 40s, and only then did I feel like I had become a fully fledged adult. And now, my own parents were starting to weaken. My father suddenly collapsed in the heat of August and passed away in his hospital room the following winter. The load from overwork must have come all at once. If he had had the examination sooner, he could have recovered. Although my mother blamed herself for not forcing my father to go to the hospital, he probably wouldn't have gone no matter how much she pleaded. It was an unremarkable parting, and I didn't even shed a tear. However, when I visited my parents' factory for the first time in decades and saw that the factory was completely rusted, I couldn't stop crying. I can never see my father standing here again. After all, I had always been watching his back, and it wasn't until I turned 40 that I finally understood that. However, if this was the case, there was no choice but to close down the factory. Of course, I wanted to take over and somehow rebuild it, but it was not realistic. I'd just follow my father's wishes and do my own thing. Just as I thought I had everything figured out and was looking ahead, unexpected events began to unfold in my life. It all started with my father's death, which even my mother was unaware of. He had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from a factory owned by his acquaintance a long time ago. Mr. Thomas, who owns a factory, used to play with me when I was young. He and my father had a close relationship, and they often visited each other's factories. However, Mr. Thomas decided to steer towards mass production early on, which led to rapid development, and now his factory is one of the leading ones in the city. About a month after my father's funeral, I was summoned by Mr. Thomas. I was sure that it was about the debt. If I paid it back a little at a time, I could just barely pay it off while I'm still alive. I didn't know how to apologize, but I was headed towards Mr. Thomas's office. However, what I heard there was shocking. Mr. Thomas said, "I will take over your father's factory and erase the debt." I couldn't believe my ears and wondered if it was some kind of joke. "In exchange, you will marry my daughter." I thought it was a dream, but Mr. Thomas was speaking seriously. He has only one daughter. She is 32 years old and single. It seems that she was working as an administrative worker at his company, and she has never been married nor had any children. I heard that he just wanted her to settle down soon. If I married his daughter, our debt would be erased, our factory would be absorbed, and they could take over the machinery and technology. However, if I refused to marry her, all of these opportunities would disappear. I couldn't hide my confusion and quickly said what was bothering me. I don't have any particular experience with romance. Before he could even feel sorry for himself, he started talking. "It's the same for my daughter, so please just meet her," he said nonchalantly. I ended up visiting Mr. Thomas's house and waited for his daughter in the living room. When the door opened, I couldn't help but catch my breath. On her face, there was a large burn mark, and the color of the skin on each side was different. It was clear at first glance that something had happened. The reason why Mr. Thomas offered to forgive the debt in exchange for marrying his daughter became clear. Surely, because of this wound, there wouldn't be any discussion of marriage. And what really tightened my heart was the fact that she accepted such a marriage. She said, "My name is Dorothy. Nice to meet you," and greeted me, giving the impression that she had no intention of opposing her father's words. I was bewildered and unable to say anything. She said nonchalantly, "My father told me everything, and if it's okay with you, I don't mind anything." She told me that her facial scar was caused by a burn when she snuck into the factory to play when she was a child. This offer might be good for me. My father's factory could remain, and I wouldn't have any debt. And on top of that, I'd be able to get married. However, there's no benefit for Dorothy. We both gazed at each other for a while without saying anything. What came to my mind was my father, of course. He left behind something unbelievable in the end. I can't even hate him for it. And maybe that's the only feeling that Dorothy and I had in common. "Are you really okay with this?" I asked. When I looked into her eyes and asked her, there was a long silence. However, tears began to well up in her eyes and eventually overflowed. Dorothy cried like a child. "How could I possibly accept this?" she was muttering to herself. She had forced herself to accept it. "Let's not do this," I said. "I should handle my debts in the factory on my own. I can't involve her in this." However, Dorothy wiped away her tears and tried to stop me. "That's no good. I have to do something about it," she replied. She showed a lot of concern for me, and I can confidently say that I've put most of the effort of my life to come up with why. "If it's all right with you, Dorothy." When I told her what I thought, she nodded her head slightly in agreement. I said to Mr. Thomas, "I would like to marry your daughter, but as we have only just met, could I please have some time to get to know her better before starting a relationship?" That was the answer that I came up with. Mr. Thomas accepted it. I left my previous job at the steel mill and joined Mr. Thomas's company. Furthermore, I started living with Dorothy as her fiancée at her parents' home. Of course, that meant that the debt was cleared and our factory was absorbed. I began to improve the technique that my father used to protect, to suit mass production. I worked very hard every day. Mr. Thomas allowed me to work freely as long as profits were made. He didn't complain. I repeated trial and error while studying the notebook that my father had left behind. My father had looked pitiful to me, but I realized that he had an incredibly delicate and genius-like skill set. And when I returned home, Dorothy would be waiting for me, having prepared a meal, and we would enjoy a lively meal with Mr. Thomas and his wife. "I'm looking forward to the wedding ceremony," Mr. Thomas said, and laughed. Both Dorothy and I laughed as well. Dorothy called out to me from our bedroom, "Aren't you coming to bed yet?" I continued working while replying, "It's for the two of us, you know." "Thank you very much," Dorothy replied. While murmuring so, Dorothy closed her eyes. There are my work clothes that she had ironed. Every time I see them, I remember my father and mother. Then time passed, and before I knew it, 3 years had gone by. Today, we had a family dinner at Dorothy's house, even with Mr. Thomas, who usually doesn't eat with us. "Cheers to Robert's great success," he said. Mr. Thomas poured me a glass of beer. Over the past 3 years, I proposed a new processing line, utilizing my father's techniques, which resulted in a significant profit for the company. If things continue as planned, it's likely that the profit I'm making will exceed the amount of debt that my father had left. "With this, I can entrust Dorothy to you even more," Mr. Thomas said. "It's about time, isn't it? Why don't we hold the ceremony soon?" He spoke with great enthusiasm. If things continue like this, how happy would it be? However, everything I have done so far has been for this day. "Mr. Thomas, we're not going to get married," I said. I looked Mr. Thomas straight in the eye, and Dorothy, who was sitting beside me, had a similar look in her eyes, but her hands were shaking. I felt the same way. In the meantime, I would make enough profit to cover my debt and inherit my father's skills. And when that was accomplished, I would confess everything to you. I couldn't think of any other way to achieve my goal and to give Dorothy the freedom to marry. Of course, I haven't laid a finger on Dorothy for the past 3 years. However, Mr. Thomas was watching us, so we shared the bedroom. But being a fiancé had to be an act. Both she and I didn't try to get too close to each other. Mr. Thomas was shocked, of course. I had expected to be scolded, but my prediction was completely off. Mr. Thomas actually apologized to Dorothy. "I'm sorry for what I did." Dorothy had never rebelled against her father before. Mr. Thomas may have reflected on his own arrogance when he saw her strong expression. Mr. Thomas allowed us not to get married and even said that I could stay in his company and could start my own business if I wanted to. We had been lying for the past 3 years. When I first met her, I proposed to her that we lie to you and pretend to get married while we put our actual marriage on hold. In addition, Mr. Thomas apologized to Dorothy for having imposed his own ideas on her until now. "I'm sorry for everything up to now. Please live freely from now on." Dorothy was shedding tears as she heard her father apologize. With this, she will be able to lead her life based solely on her own will. After that, I decided to stay at the company and continued working. However, I couldn't continue living in Dorothy's house, of course. On the last night I spent with Dorothy, the distance between us remained as wide as ever. "Thank you very much," she said. Dorothy thanked me just as when we first met, but her expression seemed brighter and more relieved. She continued, "When you first made that proposal, I honestly thought that it was impossible. But you did manage to accomplish everything." I said, "It's all thanks to you, Dorothy, but actually, I haven't achieved everything yet." I faced her and went a little closer. She was a little bit surprised and braced herself. I had decided to achieve my real ultimate goal. I wasn't really thinking seriously, but over the course of 3 years, my thoughts had become focused solely on this. Dorothy, would you marry me? I had been constantly reminded of her beauty and kindness, and the scar on her face never bothered me at all. I was simply supported by her heart. When she is able to make her own decision on who to marry, I would propose to her. That became my true goal. She gazed at me in surprise. Of course, now that things had turned out this way, she had the right and perhaps even the courage to refuse me. Nevertheless, I wanted her, someone who has become free to choose me. If getting married is what you really want, then I'm happy to, I said, and she nodded. Then she moved a little closer to me. My eyes were filled with tears while I saw her crying. I couldn't stop the tears anymore, and I remembered my father, with the only a different kind of gratitude than before. 1 year later, we got married. I still remember Mr. Thomas's surprised face when we told him that we were getting married. I'm still working under Mr. Thomas's care. Now, my father's skills are at the forefront of the industry. He's probably laughing shyly in the afterlife. Aren't you coming to bed yet? Dorothy murmured next to me. I still want to work. I was just about to say, but yeah. Shall we go to bed now? I held her hand. I never thought that the day when I would have my own family would come, but perhaps my father would have wanted to see me like this.